Hi everyone, it's Chad Curtis again, talking to you this time about shooting video. Now, we could devote entire semesters to proper video shooting style, and we don't have that kind of time today. So what I'm going to do is a very quick overview of some of the best practices that you can use when you are going out to shoot video. Excuse me. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is composition. Your audience, when you're working in video, your audience has certain things that they expect. And so what has developed over time are what we call best practices. And there are good ways to do things. And for those of you that are, rookies, which, most of you are at this point, these rules of thumb, if you will, these best practices are a pretty good thing to stick to. Will there be a point where you will learn or want to break one of these rules, best practices? Yes, and it's going to happen. But for your teacher's purposes, for your professor's purposes, and for my purposes, for those of you that are coming to J552, since we know you're rookies, we're going to assume that if you break one of the best practice rules, that it's an error, not an artistic choice. So if it is an artistic choice, be prepared to defend it, because the assumption is probably going to be that we think you made a mistake. But if you did it for a very specific reason, and you can defend why you did it, and that the way you did it was successful, then that's a conversation to have. But I would suggest for beginner assignments like the one that you're working on, you should pretty much stick to the best practices. So let's go ahead and talk about that. I wish I had a little more time to do some graphics and that sort of thing for you. I'm afraid I don't in this case. But so I'm going to have to ask you to use your imaginations a little bit. I want you to imagine a tic-tac-toe board, so it looks like a hashtag, that covers this screen evenly. So the lines that go across are equidistant from the top to the middle to the bottom, and then same thing from side to side to side. So it's a perfectly even tic-tac-toe box. Okay. Now the reason that I'm asking you to do that is because we have a best practice in photography and videography known as the rule of thirds. And basically what the rule of thirds is it says that the most interesting points in the screen are along those lines that are a third down and that are a third up, that are a third in and a third in from this side. And where those lines cross, those little, I'm sorry, I'm doing this in a camera and it's backwards. Where those cross points, those 4 points are the point of most interest completely. Okay? So when you are framing up your shots, you want to be conscious of where those lines are, and you would do very well if you can make sure that at least 2 of those spots have your most interesting things in your frame on them. Which ones does it need to be? Well, that varies from what it is that you're shooting But as a general rule, you want to hit those at least 2 of those sweet spots. Can you get 3? Awesome. Can you get 4? Absolutely fantastic. Okay, so in the picture that you're seeing right now of me, the 2 cross points at the bottom are basically where my shoulders are, which creates a horizontal across here. And so this is a nicely framed shot because there are more reasons than this, but I do have things of interest at the cross points. Okay, now as you are setting up your shots, as you're getting your B-roll, that's a term you've probably heard. That's the video that isn't somebody's interview. It's the video that helps you to tell the story, like we talked about in the other video. As you're shooting that B-roll and you see that there's a tree, okay, well, that's a very good vertical that you can use. So if you set up your shot so that that hits on that vertical, then you've hit 2 of the cross points. If there's a sidewalk in the background that goes across the bottom horizontal, you now have hit 3 of those cross points. So look for ways to hit those cross points and to put things on those horizontals and those verticals. Okay, think that tic-tac-toe board. I don't believe our cameras here, the Stauffer Flint cameras that you can check out, have this, but there are actually professional level cameras where you can turn on a tic-tac-toe grid in your viewfinder. It won't record on the video, but it will let you see where those cross points are and help guide you to set up your shot. Okay, let's talk a little bit about shooting interviews. When you are interviewing somebody, we don't generally have people that we are interviewing look directly into the camera or have them centered like I am right now. I'm talking directly to you, and that's what the feeling is when the shot is centered on somebody. But when you're interviewing, the interviewee, excuse me, is not talking directly to the viewer. The interviewee is talking to you. So let's briefly, I'm going to jiggle the computer here to show you what it might look like if I was properly framed for an interview. There are 2 very strong considerations in addition to the rule of thirds that you want to take into account when you are framing for an interview. The first one is that we use the outer third marks, okay? And the second one is that I call it the camera sandwich. And what I mean by that is that the person you're interviewing and you, the camera is in between the 2. And you do very well if you have the lens of the camera at the eye level of the person you're interviewing and you stand next to the camera. Now remember the sandwich, you need to be on the opposite side of the camera that the interviewee is, but stand next to the camera because it'll have them looking across the camera. If you stand off to the side, you get an interview shot that looks like this. We always want to at least see both eyes when we're framing up for an interview. Now, I'm going to adjust the computer here to show you a proper framing. I'm sorry, I skipped the principles. Nose room. It feels weird if when you frame the person up on those verticals, and by the way, the outside eye, depending on which direction I'm looking, the outside eye should end up on the cross hatch that's either here or that's, sorry, this is a little tricky for me because it's mirror image, that's there, okay? So let's say that I'm going to frame myself up for an interview and I turn this to put myself in the right position. I think I turned a little bit too much, okay? Now, you'll see that if I look like this, I'm basically framed, I'm still adjusting, so that I am on the vertical of this side and my outside eye is approximately where the crosshatch is. Don't get too fussy about actual dead on, but to the best that you can do. Now, what you will notice is that this is a shot that you've probably seen before. It's a very common shot used in news, and it feels right because of 2 concepts. One is what we call headroom, meaning there's just a little bit of space at the top here. If instead, I'm going to lower my stool, you frame it and I'm too low, you see how even if I'm over here on the proper vertical, it doesn't feel right because there's so much room above my head. A good rule of thumb, we just need to see that a good rule of thumb for rookies. Again, there will be times that you'll reach the point where you are in a position to break the rules. But a good rule of thumb is that there just needs to be some daylight at the top of my head. Not too terribly much, but also don't cut off the top of my head as you're doing the framing. Okay, so set it up so there's just a little bit of. Again, I'm trying to put myself on the third mark, and it's mirror image. There's a little bit of daylight at the top, but there doesn't have to be tons. Okay, so that's headroom. You want to be sure there's a little bit of daylight, not a whole bunch, and not cutting off part of my head. Second is what we call nose room, and what that means is when you're deciding which of the two crosshatches you're going to put my eye on, it should be the one that means that there is more room in front of my nose than there is behind my head. Okay, and we call that nose room. Why? Because if I reframe this such that I'm set up over here, but I'm still looking the other direction, you see how it feels like I'm kind of bumping my head against the side over here. Okay, this is a poorly framed shot. The interviewee should have the more space in front of their nose. I'm trying to just adjust it here a little bit. In front of their nose than behind it. Okay, so this is approximately a properly framed interview shot. Now this is a little on the tight side. This might be where you would go if it was an interview that was some emotion. You might go a little bit further away if it's, like you're just interviewing the director of Parks and Rec about a new swing set that's going in or something like that. But I wouldn't go much wider than this without a good reason. Now, one thing about beginners tend to shoot everything wide because they think they need to show everything. You're actually much more effective when you shoot tight shots. So this is about the right amount of me for an interview. Okay. One last thing on two more things on interviews actually. The first one is if you take a look over here at this window, okay, it's catching the sunlight and it's pretty bright outside right now. Okay, it's the brightest thing in my shot, and therefore the camera is adjusting the iris so that it adjusts for that. That means that I'm not as bright as that is, and therefore the camera is going to make me look a little darker, which I think you can see, because it's trying to keep this from overexposing. Okay, so one thing to be aware of is that the thing you want your viewer to see or concentrate on, whether that's an interview or whether that's in your B-roll, needs to be the brightest thing in the picture. Because when framed like this, if you suddenly went to this as an SOT, even though it's framed properly, your viewer's eye is immediately going to go over here because that's the brightest thing. So how am I going to mitigate that? Well, currently I've added a light in front here to help balance that some, but also, this is where I was originally. You can see it just got a little bit better because even though it's bright back there, it's not as bright as it was when the window was in the shot. Okay, so remember headroom, remember nose room. Okay, so this direction I would be on the vertical and the room is in front of the nose. Okay, and again, you don't want me looking all the way off. You don't want to stand if I'm sitting because then I do this while you do the interview, or vice versa. Okay, camera at the same level as the eyes and you at the same level as the eyes. Okay, if they're sitting down, you may choose to sit down or kneel down so that when they answer your questions, their eyes are not looking up or looking down. Okay, now let's talk about audio. Oh, audio is important. If you shoot an interview and the entire interview did not have the audio recorded, you can't use it. There's nothing to do. And yes, there are tears every year in our newsroom because somebody went out and shot an interview and waited until they got back to the newsroom to check it, and they didn't get any audio. Okay, or they got bad audio. So That's one important thing when it comes to audio. I would always check it while you were in the field. Finish your interview and say, Mr. Jones, if you could wait for just one moment, I'm going to just make sure that everything recorded properly. Turn your camera into its playback mode, media mode. With your earphone, start to play the file that is the interview. And if you have good audio, great. If you don't, then fix it and just say, I'm going to need to ask you one of those questions over again. I had a little bit of a technical thing here, but I've got it fixed. And then just ask that one question that kind of gave you the soundbite you wanted. We're going to talk about sound bites and length here in just a second. You don't need to do hour-long interviews with people. You're probably going to use less than 15 seconds of the interview, depending upon the style that you're going for, of course. But traditional SOTs, you're not going to be using tons and tons and tons. So ask 3 or 4 questions. Ask the right questions, but ask 3 or 4 questions that help you to get at the emotion or the experience. Don't use the soundbite. Don't use the interview for things like, now what hours is your shop open? Well, you can see that on their website. You can tell me that part of things. The sound bites are designed to back up what you are telling me as the reporter. So if instead the story is about how well, this happened recently to one of my favorite restaurants in Westport, that the landlord decided not to renew their lease, and so they had to move to a new location. So to get the SOT of, so what is the address of the new location? Well, I can look that up, or I could ask that off camera and include that in my story. But what went through your head when you heard that they were not renewing your lease? There's the experience. There's the emotion. That's the sort of thing that I can't tell. I don't know what it felt like to be a restaurant owner who lost their lease. That's not in my experience. That is in her experience, though. And that's something she can tell me that I can't find out from other sources. So, 2 things about SOTs. You want them to tell the experience and emotion. Those are the things that you want to have in your SOTs. Don't force it. You're not trying to make people cry here necessarily. But use your questions to elicit responses that will help the viewer to feel the emotion and the experience. Oh, my little light went out here. It must have thought that I'd stopped talking or working with that. And then the second part of the SOT is to get the to have your questions ready and use the SOT. It doesn't want to stay on anymore. I've already kind of proven the brightest thing in the room thing to you, so I may, if it goes out again, I may just let it go out. The SOT is not what you use to tell the story. The SOT is what you use to back up what you, the reporter, are telling about the story. I'll go over that again. The SOT is not what tells the story. You use the SOT to back up, I'm just going to let it go out. You use the SOT to back up what you are telling me in the story. Okay, so think about that as you're putting things together. Now, let's talk about microphones. Use them. Okay, now you might say to yourself, well, my camera has a built-in microphone, or my camera has this shotgun microphone on it. Well, those microphones are fine, they do work, but unless you happen to be very close up in the time that you're shooting the interview, they are better used for the ambient sound that's around what's going on in the camera. So when you have your B-roll and you're getting shots in the park, we hear birds singing, we hear children giggling, whatever the natural sound is. When you are conducting an interview, use a microphone. It's recommended that it be a clip-on microphone, also known as a lav, short for lavalier microphone. Here's an important best practice. Hide the cable. We should not see the cable when you attach the microphone to the person. That means you may need to ask them if they would run it up their shirt, because generally we would put it about right here on the person. You might ask them if they would run it up their shirt and clip it there. If they're not wearing a button-up shirt like I am, they've got perhaps a t-shirt on. Another is to run the cable up their back and to bring it over their shoulder, kind of tucking it under the collar and then clipping it to the collar about right here. But regardless, it's considered very amateur for me to see your microphone cable. So be sure that you dress the cable, is the term we use. We should not see that cable. And then when you get back to edit, make sure that that's the audio you use, because your ambient microphone may also be picking this up. Make sure that you use the correct audio track. But if you don't use a microphone and the audio is bad, it reflects poorly on you. It's not professional. So we want to start teaching you professional practices right from the beginning. Use a microphone, set the levels, and then make sure you use the correct track of audio. I'm going to be honest with you, with the Stauffer Flint cameras that have the shotgun microphone on them, if I'm not getting ambient sound, I'm getting an interview, I'll oftentimes just unplug that microphone just to make sure that I don't accidentally, back in editing, grab the wrong channel of audio. Okay? Let's now, that was pretty extensive on setting up interviews, but interviews in journalism, audiovisual journalism, are very important. They are backing up what you are telling the people at home. This is not just you making stuff up. You're talking to experts, or you're talking to those who experienced it, to be as accurate as possible. And again, they back up the reporting that you're doing. Let's talk though about the other video that goes along with it. If you're used to writing text-only stories, magazine, newspaper type thing, even writings for your classes, you can write it however you want to. You haven't necessarily had to think, well, how am I going to support this with pictures, with video? That's a new consideration in moving into audiovisual media. So you have to get enough, and the term we use is B-roll. It's an old film camera term. We won't get into it right now. But B-roll is the video that you play while your story is being told, and you intersperse those sound bites into it depending on which story form you're using at that particular moment. The B-roll needs to be varied. We don't want to see the same shot, the same shot, the same shot. And you need to get a lot of it. You need to get a whole lot more than you think you do. Because when the time comes for editing, you're probably only going to use about 5 seconds of any particular shot. Any longer than that, unless there's a lot of action going on, your audience is ready to move on to the next thing. So, a suggestion that I was given one time that I think is wonderful is what's known as the video cha-cha-cha. So I'm back at that park, and I'm just getting video of the park with the trees and that sort of thing. So the cha-cha-cha is wide, medium, tight, tight, tight. Meaning, I frame up a wide shot, which is an establishing shot. I push the record button on the camera, and then I go hands off for about 15 seconds. Because again, you're probably going to use about 5 seconds of this. I stop the camera, I zoom into a medium shot, and then I press record again. Hands off for about 15 seconds. Stop the camera. Then, from that original shot that or even the medium shot that I'm right now, 3 different things of interest that are in this vista in tight. So, tight shot of the bird in the nest. A tight shot at 15 seconds. I did it again. Tight shot of a bird in the nest. Hit record, 15 seconds. Stop the camera. Find a different tight shot, the knot in the tree. Hit record, 15 seconds. Then find a third interesting thing in there, the squirrel that's on the side of the tree. Hit record, 15 seconds. Wide, medium, tight, tight, tight. Okay? Now, and that's just for that one shot. Now you want to go to where the swing sets are. Now there's privacy things about children and that sort of thing. Let's pretend for our purposes right now it's an empty swing set. Okay? You get a wide shot, you get a medium shot, and then you find 3 interesting things to go tight, tight, tight. 15 seconds each will probably do that for you. And you do that until, sorry about that, got a little, had to adjust. You do that until you feel that you have got what you need to be able to tell your story effectively. And you have to be thinking about that. What do I need to show for the story that I'm telling? If the story is not that this park has been renovated, but that the power company has just installed incredibly high voltage wires over this park and there are parents who are concerned, then you need to be sure that you're getting video of the light poles and the lines, as well as a wide shot that shows the proximity of the light poles with the swing sets and that sort of thing. So it's not just merely show up and start taking all kinds of video and hope that you have things that'll work. Think about what your story is about and what you need to gather visually to make that happen. Let's talk about editing. I don't know what the requirements are for your editing project for your 415 class. In 552, we edit everything in Adobe Premiere. And we will give you editing instruction, but just a couple of tips on editing. Use strong video. You want to really grab somebody's attention with what they're seeing. Rookies tend to frame things too widely or to use too many wide shots. Use your mediums and use your tights as well. There's a concept called a jump cut, and what a jump cut is when the background of the scene doesn't change significantly, but the subjects in it do. So imagine if I'm editing together highlights from a basketball game, and the players are here, 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 and here, 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 here. And then I immediately edit to the next highlight from the game where the players are not in the same spots. It's going to the viewer, it's going to be like they just magically popped to somewhere new. So we call that a jump cut. Okay? Jump cuts are bad. We do not want jump cuts. How do you avoid a jump cut? Wide, medium, tight, tight, tight. Show me something else for a couple of seconds that's connected to the story. You know, a shot of a cute kid that's got a jaybird tattoo on their cheek, or a shot of the scoreboard, or the cheerleaders doing that thing, which I've never really understood. Show me that for 2 seconds and then go back to your next shot. You've reset the screen and it won't feel like they just jumped from one place to another. So if 2 consecutive shots are too similar, it's going to look like a jump cut. You can really avoid that by mixing in your wides, mixing in tights with your wides. Really, once you've established, you probably don't need to go back to a wide shot again unless you have to reestablish somewhere else. Work with the medium and mostly the tight shots. There's another concept that we call a flash frame. And what that is when clip number 1 and clip number 2 come together, but you didn't quite get them exactly together. And there might be 1, 2, or 3 frames of emptiness or black in between them. Okay? And so what will happen is as your piece plays, all of a sudden there's this little flash of black in there, and then we see the next thing again. We call it a flash frame. The key there is to make sure that you butt things together and get them together solidly so you don't leave any space in between. Last but not least, I would suggest to you that don't just assume because you've reached the end that you're done. You should always go back, whether we're talking writing or video, go back and look at your work. If your work is if there's something that doesn't look professional, or you suddenly notice a jump cut, or you suddenly notice a flash frame, you can now fix it. Do all that before you export your movie. If you will do that, it will help you from making mistakes, because as a teacher, I know that your teachers are in the same position as I, which is that when I can only grade what you submit. And if you're like, oh, well, I know I put those two together and there was no space in between them. No, you didn't, because what you submitted has a flash frame in it, and we can only grade what you submitted. Okay, this has gone on long enough. I really hope that you got some basic tips. For those of you moving into 552 next semester, there will be a lot more on this, and we'll do training and help you get where you want to be with this as you're heading into an audio-visual media career. But again, those of you that are even thinking that you want to do a text or web social-oriented, you're going to have to be working with video and at least still pictures, and those composition rules matter then too. So keep all this in mind as you learn what you need to learn to be able to do your video projects. I wish you the best of luck.